Great. Okay, everyone. Thanks for rejoining us. I'm now really pleased to welcome Marit Hansen, the keynote speaker for today. Marit is the data protection commissioner for one of the German Länder, Schleswig-Holstein, and she's chief of the Unabhängiges Landeszentrum für Datenschutz, and she's been in those roles since 2015. And she's a longtime friend of PETs and the community around privacy enhancing technologies, and is a real beacon of expertise within the German data protection system and data protection more broadly. So in HotPETs, we're trying to get lots of different voices from different angles to the table, and we're really pleased that Marit is able to join us to talk about PETs and DPAs. Perfect is the enemy of the good. Over to you, Marit.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very pleased to be invited, of course. Also very nice introduction of my person. Perhaps one more important background information. I'm a computer scientist by training, but I have to work in this very legally influenced part, and you will see what this is about and perhaps why sometimes there are misunderstandings or how we can perhaps improve the DPAs, the PET community, the collaboration in a way where we really strive for the better. And so I think perfect is the enemy of good. This is the saying. It was, well, perhaps by Voltaire, but also others are always doing that. But let's see how it goes. And if now I have my second slide here, if you don't see it, please call in. But otherwise, so this is the setting of ULD. We are in the very north of Germany. And this means that it's a nice touristic angle with the Baltic Sea and the North Sea at the borders here, and in the very north is Denmark. And this means we are also very much interested in cooperation, probably because there were so many people relying on the sea and traveling, and we'll see how this will work out. Here in Germany, it's now 5:15, and it's very hot, especially because we are not used in the north of Germany to a hot setting. And I'm looking forward to coming and meeting you in person at some next events, if it's possible again, of course. Okay, what am I talking about? Perfect is the enemy of good. And I only learned recently that very many people interpret the saying in a different way. So some think perfect is the enemy of good means let's strive for the perfect, let's strive for the better, because if we only have something which is okay, perhaps this is not good enough. Let's go for the perfect solution. But then more and more it's being discussed as a bad thing, that perfect is a bad thing because they are rarely achievable anyhow. And then you may stop already when it's sufficiently okay. And what is it? What we are now discussing here with data protection. And well, we will see after my last slide whether you think it's more A or more B, or we can combine it in some way. My overview is I want to tell you a little bit about data protection. You know that already, of course, but the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is our very big guidance, very big legal reform result from 2016. It's valid from 2018 now. And I don't think it's a success story yet, but still it has some influence even outside Europe, and therefore it makes sense to have a look. I also want to point out, and this is even not well known in Germany and even not well known by citizens or lawyers, how DPAs are doing their daily work, how they at least have to work. Perhaps they don't work always in that way, but this explains a bit how it's what is not working so well yet, or how we can improve the perhaps also collaboration. Then data protection by design and by default. It's kind of privacy by design and by default. I want to have a look together with you in one of the articles of the GDPR. And then let's discuss together how to bring PETs into reality. So Data protection is more than only protecting your own data. It's not about owning your data. It's something which has been, well, motivated by an imbalance in power, meaning that there are many companies, also states, processing data about persons, personal data, in a way that it's not known by people, not transparent by them, and they really well see that those who own data or who can work with data, they also have some power, and this power imbalance. This is motivating the main legal basic rights and for data protection, but also that it's not only about, of course, looking at the organizations, but taking the perspective of the individuals. And some people think with security, everything is already explained. Obviously, it's not. So here we try to look at the perspective of the individuals and the risks. And it's about the risks to the rights and freedoms that are defined and specified in the European basic law, so the fundamental rights. But this is, I think, something which in theory is quite agreed on throughout the world. In practice, well, it does not work that well. The General Data Protection Regulation was set up in 2016 as the successor of the General Data Protection, or not General Data Protection Directive. A directive in European law means that each of the member states, of the 27 member states, have to transpose the directive into their own national law. And a regulation means they should use, or the regulation applies directly, although we have here now a general regulation, which means that most of the parts apply directly and some can be specified by the member states. And the objective was a real harmonization, a level playing field, something where the full European Union, the entire Union, agrees on some standards in data protection. But there are also opening clauses, so specification possibilities, and well, it's already more than 3 years old, and really lacking some enforcement. So if you have a look how the big players on the internet have changed their data processing, yes, they did that, but not necessarily because they wanted to do something in favor of data protection. Sometimes it seems that it's something where they pick up or try to perhaps even sabotage some of the regulations, some of the requirements, and interpret them in the own way. And right now we are still lacking some enforcement instruments. But perhaps we can come to that as well. The game changer idea, this was the advertisement for several years. I think it may work out. And there are several tools that are, some of them are new, some have been existing in national law already, and some are old concepts that now should have some more effect. Something which is quite interesting is the market location principle. This means even those companies that are not located in the European Union, but work and observe, monitor behavior of citizens in the European Union, they are also bound to the law of the European, the General Data Protection Regulation. Because, and even if it's not about selling goods, but working with data, meaning tracking, for example, tracking of people, monitoring online, the online world. This is something where it's not necessary to have the company located in the European Union. Still, the GDPR applies. Well, there are some difficulties with that, but it's something that makes sense to have a look at if people are developing solutions for that should be used as well in Europe, or if the European market is being addressed. The data protection by design and by default provisions, they were new to European law, but obviously the PET community was aware of many of those things as well. And I think if you have a look at the Article 25, we will do that together, it may be disappointing. It's not what you may expect. The GDPR has a basic concept of tackling risks and knowing the risk, doing some impact assessment if there are high risks, and having some remedies and sufficient remedies, of course. And therefore, this means that high-risk data processing needs to be better safeguarded. There are more guarantees necessary than low risks. But where to draw the line, how to define that, and there's obviously something where the debates are ongoing. The most thing that got us awareness for data protection, and it has changed for the last 5 years, was the section on fines, because they're very high fines. Some are so high they are very, well, maybe even unrealistic to get this kind of money, but it can be millions of euros as a fine. I will show you that the fines are not the strongest instrument to do something, but the fines got us the awareness, but also the way of everybody who doesn't want to pay a fine or wants to protect their company, they are hiring lawyers, and then the next steps will be a proceeding before court. And this is also something which, where we see that this will be something that won't change so quickly. There are data protection principles. They are defined in Article 5. I only to mention them in a brief way. If you have worked with them, I think they are quite okay. If you want to understand them in this way, perhaps it's a little bit difficult with the wording. What about the difference between data minimization and storage limitation, early deletion? Also, what about the security things together with accuracy? But let's skip that a little bit. In principle, it's about fairness, a fair data processing, and the principles are, well, a little bit more specific, of course, but they are not that specific. And as always, the principles are hardly met to 100% in each scenario. Often it's not possible because there are some dependencies. If you optimize something or enhance a principle, then the implementation of others may be different. Okay, so I will show you how we are working. And first, if you have a starting point, the tasks in Article 57 the GDPR, the 99 articles, by the way, there are very, very many of the tasks. And in principle, it's about monitoring and enforcing the application of this regulation. The powers, they're quite interesting because they're investigative powers, corrective powers, and it's also something on authorization and advisory powers. But let's have a look at the corrective powers. They are the real powers of a data protection authority. And if you want to understand how this works, usually we are very much driven by a complaint. The complaint will be filed usually by an individual, saying my data has been misused, or I haven't gotten the full personal data when I asked that I wanted access to the personal data. The data has not been deleted, has not been rectified, and there are some of those complaints, or I didn't get sufficient information. We receive this complaint as the DPA, and then we examine whether this is a valid complaint or not. And very often, in principle, it's valid. There are very, very few where we already see that it doesn't make sense. But we also have to check whether this is something in our jurisdiction. And you've seen, first of all, I'm German, so some parts where the location of the company is not in Germany, we have to forward to the right member state DPA. Or if it's something where another Land, a Bundesland, a region of Germany is affected, then we have to forward it to them. So the examination of the complaint means also checking how many of those are really in our jurisdiction, and we can and have to work on, and which is in the competence of other member states or other German DPAs. In Germany, it's extra complicated because we have also something like telecommunication, which is then put on the federal level, but some parts are in the Länder levels, schools, police, and so everything is very regulated, but sometimes in different ways. But in general, I think it does make sense to overspecify, but the handling of a complaint has to be, of course, with the right DPA. Otherwise, it's not helpful because it may not be enforceable. Then the investigation of the case starts, and this may take perhaps months or longer. And then the assessment will have a first solution. What has happened? We need a fair hearing. This means if there's something where we see there's a breach or there's happened something which should not have happened, then we have a preliminary assessment and ask the company, the organization, what they say about it. Perhaps they have another way of explaining why this happened. Perhaps it's a structural difficulty. Perhaps it's something which is based on a misunderstanding and there is no case. But this takes, again, 1 or several months, because usually it's a written hearing. So we are sending letters, they are answering, or emails, but they are answering. And then this may happen a few times. There is a completion. And I told you already that it's not only about fines, but also about other instruments. I'll show you on the next slide. And if the organizations are not believing our assessment, they criticize that they can challenge it, and there's legal remedy, and there's proceedings, they can go before court. So this is a list of the corrective powers, and something is quite, well, not so infringing in their business models, but some are sometimes, it means they have to change something. I will tell you about each of them. Issue a warning means if we have knowledge about something is going to happen, they explain to us they want to do some processing, and we think this is not compliant, we can issue a warning and say, if you do that, then there will be a breach and infringement of the law, and you should not do that. If they do it anyhow, and we will find out, then, of course, probably we will reassess it perhaps, but then we have to react. Issue reprimands means exposed that if the thing has already happened, and can be people have sent an email to a list, but they didn't put the recipients in the BCC blind carbon copy field, but every email list, every email address was accessible to the other recipients. Then usually if it's the first time and it didn't happen on purpose and there's no high risk content, then it's only something where you have to take action that does not happen again, but there won't be anything more on that. The bottom line always is to order the controller, or the responsible entity, or the processors, those who are doing the data processing on behalf of the controller, to comply with the GDPR, and this can also be the data subject's request. Access, right to access, rectification, erasure, and so on. And sometimes they did not do it, at least not in a complete way, or, well, there have been some difficulties, and this, of course, then has to change. Also, to bring processing operations in compliance. So an order is an official letter, and it's at least if we issue and impose a temporary or definitive limitation, a ban on processing, saying you must not do this kind of processing. You cannot go on with your data processing in that way. Then it's something which stops or has to stop their process. And usually this is something where in the hearing, they say, no, of course, we believe this is legally compliant. And this means that they will go before court and stop our limitation order. The administrative fines, for example, I already told you about that. And so the legal remedies against our decisions are quite normal. And I told you I'm a computer scientist. I think courts are very valuable and we need them. But this means we have several cases right now. The oldest one that is still ongoing is already more than 10 years old because of so many courts being involved, so many different perspectives. Sometimes it takes 2 years between the first instance and the second instance and so on. So it stops very often what we are doing there. And one thing is about video surveillance, for example, in a fitness studio. And although we won the first, our decision has been confirmed by court. They are now checking whether they want to have the next instance, and this means it's not changed. So the video surveillance is still going on, and this also stops us and demotivates the data subjects, demotivates us. If we are doing investigations, which is very necessary, we see that usually the complaints only address the visible part. So if you want access and you don't get access, then you feel that this is not as you expect. It's not the right thing. But sometimes there are structural effects or structural mistakes, and you can hardly notice that. Some things are in the public area where, for example, the police control. How does the police work? Do they take your data? Is there something happening where your IP address, where your phone number plays a role? And this is something where you hardly notice or get the information beforehand. And this means the complaints are rare. But this means for us that we have, meanwhile, mandatory investigations in the police sector. And I think we need it also in other sectors where it's clear that we regularly have a check, because otherwise it's not sufficient. People won't notice what is happening. So as this in this picture, you only see the very top, and perhaps the deficiencies are below sea level. We also have the problem of very often the data controllers cannot explain what is happening. They don't know about their data processing. And even if they ask their processors, think of Microsoft 365, you still won't know exactly what is happening. At least I haven't understood everything, and I haven't got all the information. Perhaps you're better off, but how does it work with an investigation? Can we stop data processing, especially if it's something where people rely on that, if it's in principle a non-auditability? The GDPR says they have to be accountable, they have to give proof, they have to demonstrate the compliance, but this is something in reality which is often a problem. Also, investigations are always happening after the fact, so that they are all already ongoing. There's some other instrument like a prior consultation. Then people think, the organization thinks there may be a risk, and then they can ask us beforehand. But usually the data processing has started already, and if we find out, then if it's a breach, then it's something where the organization also wants to correct it. If it's something where it's part of their business model, they of course don't want to change. What we also see, one thing is the fan page case with Facebook. They are moving targets. So if we find out this is not legally compliant, then there might be a small change. And then we sometimes have to reassess everything, not only the last pages of our assessment, but perhaps the bottom line is thinking of, is something now which really made a change? And if we find out, no, it's still, or in another way, not legally compliant, then again, change can happen. And it's very difficult then to impose a ban or order something if the item of interest is changing all the time. Some organizations even don't change because they feel so secure. And sometimes I feel like Sisyphus, so it's something where we always have to redo the work and don't see a motivating result, which does not mean that we don't have any results. It's only that some have very professional means to evade the compliance or the way that the DPAs can really make a change. But this also means that we are very often the target of attacks by industry, because meanwhile if we have an assessment and even publish an assessment about the processing is compliant or it's not compliant, then it can influence the market. So this has changed a lot. This means we are more powerful meanwhile. On the other hand, this means that it's always good to go before court or to bash your DPA, or to publicly attack DPAs, privacy commissioners, because this may be another way of stopping their assessment or while trying to silence them. It's clear for us that a compliant, saying if data processing is compliant, only means at this perhaps second, or when in the scope of our assessment, the time in this time of our assessment, and it can be based on our own investigation, but it can also be based on a non-existing, but in short time will be existing certification or a court decision, a final court decision. For most of the operations, for most of the IT systems, this is not the case. So we don't know exactly, have no internal information. Sometimes we know it's not compliant, again, on the basis of our own investigation, and also with input of security researchers, of privacy researchers. So this is very important. And we, at least my office, is doing some monitoring on getting this information when there are problems, when there are breaches, but also when the business models rely on something which is not compliant. But again, if we want to publish this assessment, we have to make sure this is in our jurisdiction, or we are affected. Schleswig-Holstein citizens are affected. And otherwise, the competent data protection authority would of course have the task to do that. For some of them, it's easy to collaborate, and we will perhaps even share the investigation effort. But sometimes it's clear that they want to do their own investigation, and it's not so much a collaboration, and perhaps we even won't get final results. And very often we don't know exactly whether it's compliant or not, but then again, on a basis of a complaint, we can go forward. Because many people in the COVID times wanted to know, is this a good software or not? Please decide. We want to be compliant, but you have to give us the information. This is good, this is not good. And our Berlin colleague did something like that, and mainly on the basis of checking the data protection policies or contracts, and seeing here with the traffic light model, this is something which is green in principle. You can use it in a data protection compliant way, or it's red because there are some difficulties. It can be belonging to a Schrems 2. That means that data are being transferred from Europe without a legal basis or without supplementary measures and so on. So, but they got very much difficulties when they published that, and they stopped publishing that for some days, I think only, to check it again, because big companies said, but you mentioned our name here, and we don't think that you should put us together with a red traffic light. And then they wanted to go before court, or saying you must not publish this information anymore. At least what we could agree in Germany, and I also know it from some other countries, that we can provide checklists. Because I think I know about 40 video conferencing tools, not that I have used them, perhaps 10, but that I know that so many are being offered. And many people are writing emails to the DPA saying, oh, we have a good alternative, please recommend our system, which we cannot investigate so much, because how much effort do we have to put in something where we say it's now the green light? We can really be sure that this is something we can recommend. So usually our resources are bound already with handling complaints. With this checklist here on data protection and video conferencing, the organizations, the data controllers, can check, or also when they do procurement, can ask the vendors whether they comply or not, or how they interpret that. And at least it's something where they have a discussion basis. We also saw that some of the vendors used that checklist and saying, oh, we filled it in for you, dear data controller, in the school sector, for example. Please use now our system. We have done everything the data protection commissioners in Germany wanted us to do. And not every field was properly filled in. There are some misinterpretations, but as a data controller, it's sometimes very difficult to decide. It's very specific, and again, the moving target problems. Also, we see that some problems are perhaps also a cultural thing, and not everybody agrees whether they are structural value or not. So you see on the left side a very old case, Google Street View, you know, the maps with some pictures in them, some photos with the Street View cars. And here, this is a headline from 2008, 13 years old. German towns saying nein to Google Street View. And they mention the very small town Wolfsee. This is about 8 kilometers from here. And there are about 5,000 citizens. And they said, no, we don't want a camera looking into our gardens, seeing whether we have cars there, which kind of cars. And even the last sentence of the mayor, I think, or leader of a party in the town council said, you can see everything in those photos. That is opening house and home to criminals. Obviously, there was a big debate, especially in Germany. There were some debates in other countries, but especially in Germany. And if you look now into Google Maps and see the Street View provisions, there are hardly any pictures. There are some from for big cities in Germany, but also there's an opt-out way. There's of course this blurring. So Google changed their system. They offered a lot. Because there were other problems as well. Perhaps you remember that Wi-Fi data was recorded, and there were other problems as well. But I think it's rather a communication disaster from that time. When Apple Lookaround came up a few years ago, again, several people did not agree that they should have a look via their cameras or publish that information. But I think the cultural debate was more, the old people did not like it, and the younger people said, let's have a look. It's something we can have a look outside. We can always have our own photos, and of course this is always difficult. Where's now the line between what is public information and should be public information, and what is something where private information is affected? The right news here is not so old. It's from last year and also this year. It has been very much debated. The Tesla cars with their Sentry mode, because they are also doing some video surveillance of the public area, the open room there, and which meanwhile is very much debated whether this is illegal, whether there's something like if you touch a Tesla car and then the sensors only begin recording that, then it's different from doing that all over the time. But in general, we have to first see other complaints, because then we are already in and we have to handle complaints. All normal complaints have to be handled. But very often it's not then a structural problem. Here I would agree that there are structural problems, although, and we have video surveillance cases more than 100 a year. And one person works only on video surveillance cases. But is this now something where we can also have a structural solution, something where it's much easier, perhaps, for everybody to apply to comply with the law? Because right now people go to the discounter, buy their video surveillance, their webcam, of course we are now also using our webcams, the dash cam for their cars, and very often it's at least in the way it's being used, not legally compliant. And this means who to address. Is it really something where the private people, the private persons should be applied, or the vendors? Because both are not addressed by the GDPR. In this case, the private people are not so private because they are using the public space, but the vendors could try to sell their goods without being compliant. And also here we see other member states perhaps have other cultural backgrounds. Let's go now to Article 25. I told you already it may not be so attractive to read. And we see it here, the first paragraph in an abbreviated way, taking into account the state of the art, the cost of implementation, and so on, the risk of varying likelihood, and then the controller should implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to implement the data protection principles. What I think everybody agrees, it's about the full life cycle. It's something where data minimization should be applied very much. And also that next paragraph here, or the second part of the article, it's also about the defaults, setting the right defaults, the pre-settings. In reality, I hardly see any good defaults, especially in the online world. Very often it's the other way around, that they're greedy business models, and so it's a bit more difficult for people to protect their personal data. But how to bring it into reality, I think I will rush a little bit through this part, but because it has been very much published, and go then into more detail after a few slides. Of course, we can think about how to apply those data protection principles, and meanwhile there has been some work trying to do that, but think of the entire system and not only one principle. And it's about technical and organizational measures. It's not only about IT systems. A standard data protection model is a little bit older than the GDPR, and we also tried to, and I was one of those who were and still are trying to give help and to developers, because it's an extension of the confidentiality, integrity, availability system of the IT security world by unlinkability, so splitting information, transparency, being able to inform about that, and also intervenability, the possibility for people to react to perhaps also stop a processing, to intervene, to get their rights. Data minimization is something which is always necessary. I personally think it's part of the unlinkability debate, but some people like it more, well, in an extra way. And here I already explained it, and you know that better, perhaps even better than me, how to deal with that. Even, but still, it's about the risks and the rights and freedoms of natural persons, not one size fits all. And one of the criteria was here state of the art. So how important is the state of the art? Because pet community is doing something. You're at the forefront of, and research is, of course, at the forefront, where something is not yet state of the art. Does it have now some influence for the DPAs? And from my perspective, yes, it should have, and it will have, and it has to have influence. But still, our controllers, so controllers in my area here, they want standard market solutions. Therefore, the big players offering something where you don't have to care, where everything is already done, this is usually something people go for. Some develop their own solutions. And here I really think we have to pronounce the D in research and development as well, because it's about having some solutions. Open source code must not be underestimated, because if it's there, and if, of course, at best maintained in a way, then we can use as a DPA that for arguing you have to consider this as an alternative as well. But usually it's not our task to state which alternatives exist. So we don't have a market overview, and we cannot have a market overview. We even must be independent usually from the market. But still, if something has failures or there are risks then, and there are better solutions. If the risk is not bearable, if the remedies are not sufficient, then this may be a way out. I want to point you also to kind of thinking of readiness analysis for the adoption evolution. We use that as in a project, learned from the technology maturity whale. You see here the shape of a whale. And going back here, of course, there are some parts where we see already crypto is not state of the art anymore, or think of Windows XP or so. Still, if I have a look here in our investigations, there are sometimes those techniques still existing. And there might be even a way where it's legally okay to still use those systems, usually if they're not connected to the internet and they're very much secured, because sometimes the migration for a very specific software, which is not maintained anymore, may be too expensive or too difficult, and perhaps for some archiving purposes, even old systems are kept up. But of course not, if there are no updates anymore, they must not be used in a network or not in an internet connected way. Okay, for a readiness scale, we also thought about, and now think again about research, the idea, the research, the proof of concept, pilots the product, and if it's outdated and not maintained anymore. And but we must not discuss it only from a maturity or readiness perspective. We need the quality. If it's bad or risky technology, then we don't want to say it's state of the art, because of course the other criteria are not fulfilled. And we tried to have this very basic schema with minus to plus plus, and also thought about some more criteria about the protection, the trust assumptions. Think also about centralized, decentralized data processing, side effects that are possible or can be excluded, hopefully, the reliability and so on, and have an overall total quality. So let's combine it now with Article 25 GDPR. So what does this article ask for? And I've one proposal here. It may be something you see in the middle line, which is legally okay. Of course, if it's a product, then it may be sufficient. But proof of concepts from that are very, very good, very, very mature, and have a good quality of pets, shouldn't they be considered? Or should we even have a broader view and think of ideas? So if there's a published idea in the pet community, should this be now something where the DPA said, but we should know that? I agree. We should demand it. Well, that's usually difficult. Or do we step back and only have this, which probably is approved by the courts? If there are products and they're at least okay, then Article 25 would be fulfilled. This is a little bit disappointing. So we need some parts where we can advance the state of the art, and not only, of course, looking at only one pet component, but I'd like to get more of the good research, the good systems, the good ideas into reality. And then there's a question whether the excellence counts anything. Perhaps not today, because usually the court would approve good enough. But if we go ahead and look into the future, perhaps 3 years' time or so, and this is something where the DPAs can also give some advice, saying, today it may be sufficient with this kind of, let's say, crypto. But be aware, there will be changes, there will be better ways to attack a system, but there will also, or there is already perhaps proof of concept of better solutions. You may be okay right now, but not in 3 years' time. So kind of early warning. So what about now the conclusion? Now I can show you the full picture. Building the sustainable and resilient systems without undesired side effects is, of course, not easy at all. And only doing some pet component research is sometimes not the same. But obviously, the community is very ambitious, and sometimes the reality is less ambitious. I want to tell you now my findings. I think data protection by design and by default is not only demanded by Article 25 in the GDPR, but is to be demanded by controllers. And we also check in their procurement whether they ask for that, whether there are some guarantees, whether this is where the vendors, the manufacturers, have to argue, yes, they did it, they considered the principles, they have some way of developing. So if it's ignored, then of course nothing happens, but this is something where we have some procedural ways to ask for that. Our investigations currently are already, well, driven by so many individual complaints that the structural problems can only be applied if they are mandatory investigations, for example, in the police sector, where we have extra personnel for staff for that, or if there are very interesting complaints, and there's a 101 is 101 complaints by Max Schrems. So this is something where we see also structural relevance, and where some individuals have complaints that are very much of structural relevance. But this is they're outliers. The decisions, especially those decisions with big players, concerning big players, they are always legally challenged, and it can cost us years. It slows down compliance, and also it demotivates everybody involved. Well, at least us, at least also those role models, the SMEs, for example, who try to make it right, who are investing in data protection compliance, and see that especially big players are so hard to grab, and it takes years to have all the court rulings. We won't give up, but still, this is really a problem also in motivating people. And also, it's a problem that there are so many exceptions for the public sector. We also discuss it very much, but still, it may be that, well, there are some ways of surveillance tools, of some ideas of weakening encryption, where it's so hard for DPAs to do something, because there's then a law that allows this kind of processing. So the law has to be legally challenged, and this is nothing we can do. So we have no right as a DPA to challenge a law. We have to apply the law. And this means that there are also some individuals going before a constitutional court. So this is happening, but it means, again, that the civil society has to take action. And in principle, I think the public sector should be role model, and there must not be exceptions. One thing which I also, when I listen to the talks, the GDPR assumes always clear responsibilities and organizations. But very many of the solutions, meanwhile, have to do with crowd activities by users. So people who are part of a processing, and not the main, not a central organization. And especially with unlinkability and some crypto combination tools, this is, I think, a right way to go, but it's sometimes very difficult then to have a legal clarity there, and also to find out what is now the fair way of processing. But this is probably something where we can have another talk at some other time, and I want to learn from you as well. Your work on risk is important. So not only you work on development projects, something where we see that the idea is not only on the idea level, but can be put into reality. Also, you work on risks, because the risks that are related with other people, perhaps with the market solutions, this is something where we can also have a leverage, where we can use that and say, well, but you big vendors and manufacturers, you have to solve that. Otherwise, it's too risky. It does not solve our problems. It's not compliant. So perfect is the enemy of good. What does it mean now for researchers and DPAs? It's not an either or. Strive for the better. Yes. Publish, communicate, advance the state of the art. Don't give up on being better. But also, if you think we need only good enough and the DPAs have to stop when it's good enough, even then, publish and communicate. Go ahead with what about the risks, and what about open questions also, that sometimes, and this is how research works, that this is now something where DPAs also should listen, and at least I will listen. And it's easier for us to listen to the research community than to those who are asking us almost every day from the company side, saying, oh, we want you to improve our system. Of course, very often without any cost. But I think research neutral, checkable, auditable research findings and how to communicate that to people such as me or those who are not computer scientists in the PET community. This is something where we should also go ahead, perhaps together, as having a joint task, bridging this gap, which is quite huge, in a very, and perhaps the most important digital problem to have fair data processing also in the next. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marit, for that real whirlwind talk through so many areas of data protection, law practice, and the link between technologies. We'll go straight to questions to the floor.